right at the beginning of the First World War, a new weapon was unleashed upon the world, one that we didn't even see coming because it wasn't a gun or a bomb or anything we thought of as a weapon. And yet it changed the face of warfare forever, separating those countries that had it from those who didn't. And it allowed for the raising, movement, and devastation of armies that up until that point were unimaginable in size and scale. History buffs might know exactly what I'm talking about, and that is accountants. Accountants, bookkeepers, bureaucrats. See, never before in history had armies of such size existed. They dwarfed anything that, like, say, Napoleon was able to muster. Because now, there were detailed accounts of exactly how many soldiers, how much food they needed, the exact distance to travel, and the supply lines necessary, and the estimated ammunition expenditure. We had reached a new stage as countries and intelligences that could conduct warfare on another level, total warfare. All of these things could be calculated on a great scale, one that was greater than ever before. Only aided by more long-range communication devices, and by being able to plan and account for nearly everything resource-wise, at this scale changed how battles worked ever since. So why would I start an Age of Sigmar lore series with a terribly, obviously simplified history lesson, right? If you are a fan of history like I am, you know that there were a lot of things going on, but that's just one of the many things that made World War I so crazy. Because the subject of this next series of the Ossiarch Bonereapers, the core of them is what we just talked about, but magnified to an insane scale. We're talking about these Bonereapers, and if I had to sum up their superpower, because remember, every battle tome makes their army seem unstoppable, I'd say it was calculating, right? They are a calculating faction, and that is what they bring to the mortal realms in a way that is mind-blowing. And when that strange weapon of being, exacting and calculating operates in a world where time is irrelevant for them, they are undead, they have infinite time to do whatever they need to do, backed by power and the mission of a literal god. We'll see what that does to the realms. Now, it is said that the Ossiarch Bonereapers are a direct response by Nagash to the Stormcast Eternals, right? They're his Stormcast Eternals. Sigmar made his warrior constructs, doing his thing, playing with souls and mortals, and now Nagash is doing the same thing. And while there is some truth to that, what we'll learn is that the Ossiarch Bonereapers appearing is definitely a response to an escalation. No, he wants to fight the Sigmar, and he has his own army to do so. But we learn much more than that, right? That these constructs of bone and mishmash souls was a plan set in motion long before the Stormcast Eternals. That the eternity-long plan to end all life in the realms under Nagash's rule was one that he began back in the Age of Myth. When you are timeless and driven in the way that Nagash is, you can have plots and schemes that take millennia, and the Ossiarch Bonereapers were always a part of that plan. And this may seem like a vague and crazy backstory, but if you imagine, if you will, a different AOS timeline. It's the Age of Myth. Chaos doesn't come into the realms, at least not in the same force that it did, and suddenly, breaking from every gate that leads to Shyish, Throne of Death, the colossal demigods stroll out and begin conquering everything, starting with the realm gates, and then moving on to bigger campaigns. Alright, and then what I just described is like a weird twist on the actual lore, right? Where Stormcast came out of the gates to Azir and did the same thing, but in this alternate story, there's no Stormcast. Those towering figures from the realm gates were the Ossiarch Bonereapers, coming from the realm of death rather than the realm of heavens. Because that was the plan that Nagash had in the Age of Myth. Someday, my legions will stroll forth, right? Just constructs that are meant to instill my will upon the realms. But the problem with that plan is it didn't account for chaos. He couldn't see how things were going to go down in the Age of Chaos, but the seeds of that army construction, the plans that he laid out to just kind of basically autopilot build an army in the background were already laid. Now, to aid in this endeavor, Nagash did come up with subplots meant to process things along faster rather than actually be endgame strategy. So what I mean is, you have an army that's supposed to go around and conquer and kill everybody, but what if I had, say, a giant black pyramid with a spell that would kill a lot of people? That would speed up your end game, right? It would certainly quicken up your reaching of your goal. And so that's what we find out the black pyramid was. It was one, they emphasized it very carefully, one of these kind of subplots interwoven into his greater plan, of which the Bonereapers are the finality. So definitely, in a sense, yes, they are the Stormcast equivalent for death, but their roots stretch much deeper in time than the warriors of Azir. So moving from the aerial view, what are the Ossiarch Bonereapers practically speaking? Well, they are an army of undead constructs with a singular mission: exterminate life in the realms over the millennia. Right, this is a long game. I can't emphasize enough how much everything in this book references the long game. Rather than being a wisp of death magic bound to a simple skeleton like the average necromancer can do, imagine using the porous material of bone, condensing it into its hard as metal, and then shaping it like it's clay. Right? It's with this material that the legions of the Bonereapers are built. They're not raised skeletons, but they're constructs molded from skeletal materials. And this goes for the soul in each warrior as well. It's not one soul that's bound to a warrior. Made from small shards of grave sand, right, the realm stone of the realm of death, each Ossiarch Bonereaper warrior has a gem pendant acting as kind of like a soul trap. But no ordinary soul would do for Nagash. So what he did was he took the best and brightest from the land of death and tore their souls apart. And taking things he wanted, like intelligence, battle prowess, military experience, and disposing of the rest, things like memories, compassion, and honor. Each and every Ossiarch Bonereaper is a new being, right? A patchwork of skills, values, and personalities from several of the realm's greatest warriors. And one thing that is unique about them, even in more so than their souls and how it's attached to a body, is their autonomy. You see, each Ossiarch Bonereaper has some measure of free will and thought, just enough to fulfill their mission. And in this way, Nagash uses the best parts of each leader to the fullest, right? Instead of the waves of mindless dead that just stalk the realms, these soldiers can be disciplined and focused, yet still solve problems and approach enemies with a measure of creativity. They can set traps, they can outsmart their opponents because they have this little bit of free will. Now, this isn't because Nagash values free will. In fact, the opposite is true. He despises it. But he sees the utility in having someone who can think for themselves on the fly in battle. And on that note of thinking outside the box, let's talk about their society. These guys have no time limit on the domination of the realms. So, very slowly, they have eked out of Shyish. And how they'll do that is they'll enter a region and construct something called a bone tithe nexus, and then go to each of the surrounding villages, empires, groups, whatever you want to call them, in a massive area, right? Just think of like going to a country around a specific point and demand tribute. Because when a Bonereaper army shows up, they generally don't just attack, right? A small contingent will be sent to negotiate with whatever civilization they come across, and they might sound very civil and very kind to them, like they are willing to cooperate and work together with others, and that is simply not true. This is the cold calculation that I talked about when we started, because it's kind of simple math. They need bone material to expand their armies, build fortresses and that kind of stuff. By keeping towns alive, they can collect the bones of the dead from them for, in theory, many generations. Thus, the bone tithe was born. These leaders that come to parlay do so with an offer. Give us your dead and a seasonal offering of bones that you bring to the bone tithe nexus, or we kill you now and take what you have now. So understand, this is not two societies working together. These are farmers keeping an orchard growing, right? So he can reap the harvest of apples over time, fail to pay the tithe, the exact amount based on your civilization's size, and you die. They don't perceive living things in the realms as like other worthy races. They are resources to be harvested. And here's the thing is, it's kind of understood that this arrangement really ends one way, right? At some point, could be a generation from now or so, you won't be able to pay the tithe, and the full might of Nagash's chosen will descend upon you. And so that's how they function, constantly fighting off chaos and destruction, collecting bones, enforcing the bone tithe, going to more civilized folks with an offer that they dare not refuse, all in an effort to collect raw materials to build and expand, and to do the same thing elsewhere. This is, in essence, the longest of the long games, and really hammering home why I started this series on their calculating nature as the defining characteristic of the army. They come into an area, they assess how many bones a society can muster in a given year, and then calculate how many more warriors that will enable them to build, or how big their fortifications, also made from bone, like molded from that kind of bone material, need to be, when they'll need to expand, and how much they need to collect to do so, factoring in how many cities can be tithed. Again, use math, again, to calculate every aspect of their world domination. All of it can be plotted out, accounted for, and logistically dominated. These are militant accountants dead set on conquest, and without restriction of death or time, it's the longest of the long games to see it done. But Nagash knew it took more than just math and a plan to make it all happen. And that's where Katakros, Mortarch of the Necropolis, comes in. Now, here's the thing. I was actually kind of blown away when I read this book. So, he is the defining spirit of the armies of the Ossiarch Bonereapers. And in fact, a majority of this battle tome, I feel like, is centered around him specifically. Just like Sigmar is incomplete without Galmaraz, the Ossiarch Bonereapers were not ready for prime time, meaning to be sent out into war until Katakros was returned to them, which he was since the events of the Necroquake. And since so much lore is dedicated to this one figure, we're going to cover him in a dedicated video, because he and the rest of this army are just so intertwined, he kind of needs his own video. And so stepping back, again, this is my introduction to the faction to get you excited for it. I mean, just to kind of give you a sense of how big of a villain they're supposed to be. So why are the Ossiarch Bonereapers cool? We'll say this at the top, just to give us a sense of what the rest of the series is going to be like. And the things I want to stress in this video are what make them unique, right? That they are a perfectly ordered and structured army, calculating in the extreme, constructed from body to soul with the purpose of serving Nagash. And their plan may seem silly because they are entering the fray so late into the fight for the mortal realms, but they really embody Nagash's mind when it comes to the end game, right? Nagash sets plans in place that can take eons because time means nothing. So starting the construction of an army that takes hundreds of years to get ready isn't out of place for him. The way they conduct themselves, they're slowly growing in numbers, and this slow grip of control, regularly tithing bones from nearby societies, isn't that odd when you think about them as being farmers of an orchard rather than a society trying to work with others. So it's hard to break my mind from the immediate victory to see the long game, right? We read the Rumgate Wars and we're like, yes, they closed the door, right? It feels like they accomplished something. And Nagash is over on the other side being like, so what happens to that door in 2,000 years, right? Because he's just thinking on a different level. We see the immediate and he sees the ultimate end game. And one thing I'm always leery of with new armies is how they survive the Age of Chaos, right? So Nagash started these plans in the Age of Myth when things were groovy with the other gods. Where were they during the Age of Chaos when Nagash got punked by Archaon? Well, and the book kind of addresses this really with two different ways. So one is that they weren't ready, right? Sigmar had Azira locked up for hundreds of years and let chaos reign. He had to wait because the moment he debuted with his super soldiers, meaning the Stormcast Eternals, he knew the heat was going to be turned up, which is exactly what happened, right? Chaos then responded in kind with an escalation. Likewise, the construction and harvesting we are talking about for this army takes an immense amount of time, and rather than show his hand too soon, Nagash was perfectly fine. Again, long game, eternal long game, was happy to wait in the rest of undeath while his realm fell to pieces, and he would then use this army when it's ready to reclaim it. Now, the second reason we were given for why they didn't show up till now is because they needed a leader. So right at the start of the Age of Chaos, Katakros was taken from Nagash. Again, we'll cover that more in his own video. But like I said before, he kind of is the heart and soul of this army. He turns it from a bunch of accountants and assembly-lined soldiers into a deadly weapon of Shyish made manifest. They didn't have the numbers or the leadership until now to show up. So during the Age of Chaos, while the realms descended into madness and Azir was starting to raise a new army, the Ossiarch Bonereapers were still being built and assembled, waiting for the day when they had the might and the leadership to bring the will of Nagash on the realms. It's a fascinating story, and just like every other battle tome, I don't read every detail, and this is because, specifically, I want you to go grab the book if it interests you and read more for yourself and see the art. There's a lot of cool stuff here. So, welcome, Wargamers. Today we're going to continue our coverage of the Ossiarch Bonereapers by exploring all the leaders in this faction. Now, I've already covered the big, heavy hitters, right? Arcan, Nagash, and Katakros in their own dedicated video, so if you want to see those, just search my channel for them. But today I wanted to focus on those smaller heroes that make up this army. And like a lot of GW armies these days, the heroes really define the characteristics of the entire force, right? How they contribute to that army is so tied to the nature of the faction as a whole. So in this video we have 2 named heroes and a whole bunch of more generic ones. As always, some of them have more art and lore than others. I'll be sure to post pictures of the models here as I can, just so you know which unit we're talking about. So let's kick this off with our named heroes. First up is Cavalos Xantos. Born Patru Xantos, he and Katakros the Mortar go way back, knowing each other in life, living in the same tribe, right? That Fleich is how I'm pronouncing it, tribe. And one important thing to note about Xantos is the nature of his soul. While others are ripped up amalgamations of other souls, like we've talked about before with all the other Ossiarchs, their souls are just as much constructs as their bodies. Xantos was allowed to remain intact. He is who he always has been, and that is extremely unique. Frequently in these kinds of books and battle tomes and Black Library novels, they'll paint you a picture of the norm for an army, and then give you a character who goes against that grain, and it makes them pop off the page. Well, the Cavalos is top general of the Mortarch's army, right? Second only to Katakros himself. And even in his completed soul state, right, he's completely unchanged, he has no ambition to rise above his post. He likes being second in command. And so how does someone end up in this position if they aren't one of those composite souls where it's a bunch of pieces of the best put together? Well, in life, Xantos was known as an assassin mortician. Right, picture an assassin that's obsessed with being neat and tidy, respectful and orderly. He would kill a victim, of course, he's an assassin, but then do the full mortician business, right? Make the body presentable, tidy, complete the burial, dig a grave, give some last rites. It spawns from a deep respect for death and the dead, and a skill set that just so happens to be good at facilitating people becoming dead. So a very ordered and professional person. While I wouldn't call him obsessive compulsive, he was a person deeply concerned with everything being ordered and structured, right? That there was this way that things just ought to be within the universe. Or he considered himself a purist and eschewed all distractions from his work. Kind of like we mentioned that with Katakros, where even from an early age, he just didn't like recreational things. Now, the battle tome says that he did this craft for 60 years. It doesn't necessarily mean that he was 60 when he died. He could have been a little bit older. Maybe he started the profession when he was a little bit older. But that means, at bare minimum, he still had a pretty long life, right? Unlike Katakros, he didn't have the same epic death story. It might have just been a peaceful, relatively old ending to a man. And when he did die, he arrived in his people's afterlife of Ossia. And remember from our first video, the Katakros video, this is the Flechian afterlife that is based around satisfying labor, and he found this to be his liking. There were things to do, the countryside was neat and orderly, there was peace, and there was just calm in his heart. This was the perfect afterlife for him. However, that all changed once Sigmar came. Now, I assume this is, of course, in the Age of Myth, as the Pantheon was being seeded and grown, life was being spread amongst the realms. The living had spread far and wide in Shyish, rival kingdoms fighting for dominance, making noise, filth, and disrespect for the afterlife, because after battlefields are left, over those battles, there's like dead bodies strewn across everywhere, carrion birds pecking at them, just kind of wrecking this orderly afterlife that Xantos wanted. And it sent him into an absolute uproar for a few reasons. The first one being very clear, they disrespected the dead. Right, he spent so much of his life honoring the fallen that to see the careless disposal of corpses was an absolute affront to his personal reverence. Secondly, this tide of the living in Shyish conflicted with his sense of order, right? Shyish is for the dead. The living here are like a round peg in a square hole. They don't belong here. It belongs to us. So in response, Xantos goes on a one-man crusade to kill all the living in Shyish, of course starting in his home country of Ossia. And remember, Ossia does have a military, but at this point it's meant to be defensive, that is until Katakros rises to take control of it. The two meet this time in Undeath, and the rage and fervor of Xantos is a tool that is used by Katakros. And this kind of innate desire for peace and order, right, peace meaning everyone's dead so there's no one bothering you or making a mess, made Xantos a fine leader. He was efficient, he was brutal, and he was unyielding. And this was only magnified when Katakros gifted him a weapon called the Dark Lance. Sort of think of it as like a magic blade, right? It's an arcane weapon that magnifies the wielder's intentions. So when you're wielding it, whatever you're singularly focused on, you kind of fall into madness about that singular thing. And when he gave it to Xantos, his hands magnified the desire to purge the living and push back Sigmar's influence and reclaim Shyish for the dead. So that's his number 2 guy, the guy who just wants to exterminate all the living from Shyish. And remember that Xantos represents kind of like the military arm of the Ossiarch Bonereapers. The other units we'll talk about later on represent more of like the supporting role. So you want your military guy to be solely focused on his one job, not being distracted by anything else. Next up is Volkmortian, Master of the Bone Tithe. This is an interesting one for sure. He's the leader who came in the Feast of Bone set that I'm sure one day will be released by himself in a clan pack or something. And even though he's in the same legion as Xantos and Katakros, neither of them are given even the briefest of mention in his entry. And that's because Volkmorten is first and foremost a servant of Nagash, right? Being his foremost emissary. Nagash can actually see through Volkmortian's eyes and make his presence known by kind of reaching out through his chest. And that's why if you see that picture where Volkmortian has like a kind of greenish huey ghoul coming out of his chest, that's actually the appearance of Nagash peeking through. It's a very unique and peculiar role, right? He's the statesman, emissary, but also a conqueror. It's him and his underlings that go far and wide decreeing the Bone Tithe, gathering resources for the Bonereapers' dark harvest. And as his role of emissary would make sense, he bears the authority of Nagash. So if he comes across another undead army, like let's say for example, in some bits of the Legions of Nagash book, there were like little death rattle kingdoms. If they come upon a death rattle kingdom, he immediately has the authority to take command and control it. And so his entry is kind of an odd one, right? It's almost written like he's a mortarch, right? It's that level of importance, but he isn't really. He's more like a diplomat, a representative with a lot of authority and power. But he's not given the role of leading anything in particular. Like, mortarchs all have their own kind of like divisions, I guess you could say, of Nagash's army. He doesn't really do that, but he does embody the authority of Nagash in the realms. And it puts him in a really interesting place, as he is, in theory, below Katakros, or at least, kind of equal to Xantos, right? Katakros is the leader of this entire faction, right? Only second to Nagash. And Volkmortian kind of floats in terms of authority in this weird space outside of that. For everything being so highly structured and ordered, he seems to have a unique position. And I think this is chalked up to the fact that they are just very different roles, like they're different heads of the same snake. Katakros is the militant mind, whereas Volkmortian represents Nagash's long-term interests. If we want to do this long-term and make this work, we have to collect enough raw material to make the biggest army possible, and that's why he's responsible for the Bone Tithe. Now that's it for the named characters, and we're going to jump into kind of the various roles of the unnamed one. As always, some have more lore than others, but each of them has an incredibly unique role within the army. Starting off with the Liege Cavaloi. Think of this as the generic version of Xantos, right? He's a hero on a Cavalos steed, which is the mount. And as we mentioned before, the souls of the Ossiarch Bonereapers are all, universally except for Xantos and Katakros, a composite, right? Meaning that Nagash took the best qualities from the dead heroes around the realms, tore them apart, mashed them together into one new identity with the best of the best, and he kind of put a cap on their individuality. In life, the souls that would become a single Liege Cavaloi were inspiring leaders of renown, those who could turn the tide of battle with their feats of strength, charisma, and sheer force of will, right? Think the Pattons and Churchills of our own history, something like that, right? Rallying soldiers to enormous feats of strength and achievement. In Undeath, all mashed together, they fill a very similar role. These are commonly the generals of large detachments of the army, capable of charging headlong into an enemy until it is absolutely eradicated. They're incredibly aggressive, and they focus on speed and deadly efficiency, often commanding the cavalry of an army to act as sort of a largely independent flanking force, right? And this flanking force comes around to the side, smashes into the heart of the enemy, and then when he's in the heart of it, he's able to project his presence to his men and inspire them to greater acts of savagery. And so now we're going to move away from the strictly militant aspects of the army into those that make the faction function. That culmination of accountants, engineers, and masons we talked about in the first episode, right? The force that's behind Katakros, fueling his endless war machine, but also needing him to wield it. The most basic of these support heroes is the Mortisan Bone Mason. These are the craftsmen of Nagash's apocalypse, right? Able to take ordinary bones, break it down like clay, reform it into the hardened and deadly form that are the building blocks of the Ossiarch Bonereaper soldiers and society. When Nagash was looking to create this tier of craftsmen, right, he searched all of Shyish, pulling many souls from an afterlife known as Anadyria. An afterlife for artisans, artists, craftsmen, engineers, things like that, right? Where they could peacefully practice their trades to perfection for eternity, building these great monuments and sculptures and more. Ripped from this paradise, Nagash has torn these souls apart and put their efforts and their skills to the sole creation of his unyielding war machine. On the battlefield, they can repair damaged soldiers, they can reattach an arm or legs that's been taken off of an injured fighter. And post-battle, they can be found reconstituting the bones of the defeated, able to create a new warrior's body in just minutes. They are often seen hanging out near the Gothazar Harvester, which we'll cover in another video, trying to get a sense of what materials, the quantities that they'll be able to work with. In addition to creating the physical form for the Ossiarch Bonereaper soldiers at the individual units on the ground, they're also responsible for crafting the immense fortresses and bone tithe nexuses of the faction. So everything is based upon bones, right, as their building material. Every fortification, every building, every wall, and every soldier is built from this. So these guys are incredibly important and very plentiful within a legion. Which is weird. It kind of puts them in a strange place where they kind of fill this role of medic, because they're fixing everybody, right? They're a medic, they're an engineer, and they're an artisan all in one. And I love that combination, that because everything's based off the same material, when you are the person who can craft that material with ease, you suddenly fill a bunch of different roles. Now, right below them are the Mortisan Soul Reapers. A lot of these sound the same, so just kind of be careful when you're looking up the entries here, but the Soul Reapers are very interesting. See, where the Bone Shapers are designed to create and build, like we just talked about, the Soul Reapers are designed to destroy. Formed from the composite souls of necromancers or people who tried to wield death magics, they are often considered the least among the Mortisans. The Mortisans kind of being that whole class that is about supporting the army and that kind of thing. And even though they have power, it's not the power to create, like the rest of their order has. Their design is simple. It's just to kill. In the death of the enemy, by melee or by destructive magics, their job is to release the souls, right, the raw animus energy of life, and capture it for later use. This being an essential ingredient to the Ossiarch Bonereaper process. It's not just bones. They're built upon bones, obviously, but everything has to be animated. All those souls that they take that are torn apart and put into a soldier, they come from somewhere. And on the battlefield, these are the soldiers who bring them to our next entry, which we'll talk about here in a second. But they go into battle as if they were these grim farmers reaping the crop to fuel the war machine, right? Creating dead bodies, which of course means more bones, and freed souls and the raw animus energy that there's used for making new spirits to inhabit those bodies. Where the Gothazar Harvester collects the raw bone material for bone shapers, these collect the soul energies for crafting by the next entry, which is the Mortisan Soul Masons, an incredibly important part of any Ossiarch Bonereaper Legion. It's the highest rank of the Mortisans in any given army that you're going to find, and the pinnacle of that calculating evil we mentioned in the first episode, complete with a great deal of autonomy and a sharp mind to use it. Quite simply put, these are the heroes that create those composite souls we've been talking about all week. They animate the empty bodies created by the bone shapers, and just as a gun is no use without bullets, a perfectly sculpted Ossiarch Bonereaper warrior is nothing without an equally engineered soul to turn into a deadly weapon. During a battle, the Soul Masons will be very busy, right? They'll seem kind of incredibly aloof, as if they're daydreaming or something like that, but they're actually hard at work. All of their work is mental. Because unseen to everyone, but with spirit or ghost sight, however you want to call that, they're taking souls of the dead as they're dying in battle, evaluating their worth, tearing them apart, and reconstituting them as needed. They are the on-scene arbiter of what a worthy soul is, deciding what aspects are useful, what can we use, what do we need to discard, taking the best that the realms have to offer and morphing these bits into a set of single consciousnesses, infusing it into soul gems kind of thing that adorn every Ossiarch Bonereaper soldier. They're more than just a necromancer that traps a soul and reanimates something. They really are creators, right? Progenitors of entire armies, right? Entire beings that have their own thoughts and abilities and stuff like that. It's a huge task. And to allow them to focus entirely on their work, they frequently create these mounts that autonomously steer them into battle. These are the bipedal constructs they ride into war. Not everyone digs the model, I totally understand that. But, from a lore perspective, if you didn't know what it looked like, I think it sounds super cool. And having the autonomous, vehicle carry them around allows them to dedicate the entirety of their mind to the judgment of souls, right? How many soldiers can be yielded from this battle? How many are we going to lose? What are the roles we need to fill for the next campaign, and so on. And that is it for the heroes of the army outside of the big heavy hitters, Nagash, Arcan, and Katakros we already covered elsewhere. So why are these units specifically so cool? Well, the last several armies that Games Workshop has released, at least the new ones anyway, where it's all totally new, 100%, they've been defined by a few unit kits, but a strong emphasis on heroes, right? These linchpins to make the army play thematically and efficiently, and they add flavor and character and synergies and all of that. And I think they really nailed it here, right? Nagash is about an efficient, ends justify the means kind of plan, and there's no fat in this hero selection. Everyone either leads the beast, meaning the military guys, or feeds it. Xantos and the Cavaloi lead this war engine to battle, right? Conquest to see that vision of Nagash fulfilled. But it takes so much more than just military strategy to do something as audacious as completely conquering the realms. And that's where the Mortisans come in. Their ability to create soldiers, repair them, custom craft souls for them to meet the exact needs of the moment, all on the fly, is incredible. And it keeps the snowball growing instead of the army kind of burning out as the dead are depleted. It also means that they are able to fight in a wide variety of kind of environments, right? If they need some heavy hitters because they're fighting against a Maw tribe, they can just on the fly create some of the larger units we'll talk about in the next video. If they're getting overrun, they just need more bodies, smaller guys to help defend all the leaders, they can do that. They can keep making more Mortek guard. It allows them to be independent, incredibly adaptable, and self-sustaining. And in this way, altogether, right, a legion with a full complement of these heroes can act with true autonomy abroad in the realms. And I say autonomy, of course, with the caveat that all of them are just hardwired to follow Nagash's every word. But I mean, they never need reinforcements. They don't need necromancers to summon more dead, or gunpowder to reload their guns. They don't need food or water supply lines. They are a self-contained entity bent on destruction that grows and grows the more it's allowed to survive, because by surviving, it's killing other things, gathering bones, getting bigger. And this just represents one of these legions. There's dozens at least, right, with more being created all the time. And because of that, all of these leaders together represent the long game of Nagash, right? Each of these armies growing slowly over time, spread far and wide, multiplying the whole time, because you're always adding more. It's the longest of the long games, bent on slowly choking life out of the realms. These snowballs of their army, I keep calling that because they keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger, because the more they kill, the more numerous they can become. That's how Nagash envisioned it ending. This slow, tedious plotting takes millennia, and they're just going to get bigger and bigger and bigger until all of a sudden nothing can stand in their way and everything is dead. Now, side note to this, I gotta say, my absolute favorite is the Bone Shaper. It kind of reminds me of the, the units from the Eldar in 40k, where they can, like, craft all of the buildings and that kind of stuff from their, like, Wraithbone thing, where they kind of, like, just have this artisan that can come out and just, take a almost like a natural resource and form it to their will. I really like that idea, almost as if they're playing with clay. The idea of them just hanging out next to the Gothazar harvester to, like, check out how many bones they got and, like, what are we working with today? I don't know. Kind of gives it like a Iron Chef kind of feel when you don't know what ingredients you're going to have. You just kind of make it up as you go and make it work moment type deal. I love it. So I think he's a really cool unit. Plus, that model is absolutely sick. In our last video, we met the leaders of the Ossiarch Bonereapers, and in that video, I divided those units into those that I said lead the beast, meaning that they are the martial might of the Bonereapers, and those that feed the beast, right? The mortisans and craftsmen soldiers who make things from the bones and souls of the vanquished, and they keep this war machine going, right? Lead the beast, feed the beast being, of course, Nagash's undying plans to conquer the mortal realms. I absolutely love it, and I think that they're incredibly interesting, and today we're going to talk about the beast itself, right? The boots on the ground army that is the Ossiarch Bonereapers, as we explore the various units that make up its legions. Now, as always, when it comes to talking about the individual units within an army, right, not every unit has the same amount of lore, and there isn't enough artwork in the book to give me like a full spread on every single unit. So, as I've been doing lately, I'll throw the pics of the model that I'm talking about when I get to their section, but everything else is pretty much just for ambiance, so buckle in, grab your paintbrush, and let's talk about the various units that make up this faction. We'll start at the bottom here with the lowliest warrior, and that is the Mortek Guard. And I say lowly, that's a very misleading term, right? Because actually my favorite description from them is the first sentence in their entry in the battle tome, and that is, each Mortek Guard is a walking mass grave. I love it. I love the darkness in that line. The book is continually referencing the resources it takes to make the army happen, right? Even that the lowliest soldier on the totem pole, as it were, is a composite of dozens of bodies of bones and several souls ripped apart and put back together. Each is a graveyard given this kind of unlife. And as we mentioned before, they do have a little bit of autonomy. They are not mindless drones, and the extent of their independence is pretty much limited to how they conduct themselves in warfare, but that allows them to think creatively about how best to crush an enemy, how best to solve a problem, things like that. So they're not really bound to this tight leadership structure in battle. Like you would see with other, some legions of Nagash, if they're led by a necromancer, he really is the focal point of all the independent thinking that happens in that army, right? The skeletons don't go to secure the right flank unless he commands them to. But in this army, the Ossiarch Bonereapers, they have the autonomy to make battle plans happen in responsive time on the fly. Each of these units has their own what's called hecatos. This is like a little sergeant for the unit, like a little mini boss jammed inside of the unit itself. And so even if the leaders fall, right, the actual mortisans and all the people leading the army, they still have their hecatos. And even if the hecatos falls by some weird circumstance, they are independently smart enough to figure out the best solution to their problem and get out of that tough situation. They just kind of keep going, keep responding to what's happening on the battlefield. And Nagash specifically designed them to, to take a word from 40k, know no fear. They literally cannot feel the urge to run away. And so that kind of plays into the lore where none of these units take battle shock tests. And people have various opinions about that, but I think it really fits the theme of when you're already dead and you have been divorced from the concept of fear on a soul level, you're not gonna run away. Now, their main role within the army itself is to act as the main fighting body and specifically to protect all the heroes we mentioned in the previous video. Because if those heroes fall, the army's ability to repair itself and grow, like we mentioned in the previous videos, it slows way down. And these make a great kind of bulwark, right? Like a defensive structure that can move and be responsive because on command, they can lock into an impenetrable shield wall. And they're able to repel all but the biggest targets, or the big beasts and the big, whatever the hammer of the enemy army is, that might be able to tear through some of them. But the fact is, they're meant to be this mobile fortification when they lock their shields. Now, our next unit here, for those of us who played AOS before this book's release, and even at the very tail end of 8th edition, the morghasts, right? The morghasts are a unit that is a familiar sight if you've been around for a little bit of a time here. And these are the ultimate honor guard of Nagash himself, the very first of his bone constructs, as kind of was later developed into an entire faction, the Ossiarch Bonereapers. And they go as far back as the old world. You can kind of consider them a test bed for this army. What is certain is that it takes a lot more work to go into their creation than a standard Ossiarch Bonereaper unit. Each one of them has a piece of the underworld itself embedded in their chest, just exuding death magic. And while they may seem incredibly slow and dim-witted, they are exceptional in combat. Like I said, they are the shock troops, the honor guard, everything for Nagash. But even in the big title, capital M Morghast, there are actually two different kinds of them. They break down into different roles, and both are very important. The Morghast Archi act as the bodyguards. And these aren't the only bodyguards this faction has access to. We'll talk about the other one later on. But these, obviously, in addition to protecting the leaders and keeping them safe, they have another vital role. They act as constant sources of information for Nagash. So if any leader that they come into contact with, or they're following, says anything that conflicts with the will of Nagash, the Archi will deliver swift judgment before those words are even finished. So they are a protector, sure, thumbs up, but they're also a constant reminder of who's in charge, that you're never fully trusted, right? Only Nagash himself trusts himself, right? Nobody else can even measure up. So it keeps champions on their toes about what they do with the limited freedom that they are given. Now, the other unit that goes under kind of the heading, I guess you could say, of Morghast are the Harbingers. And these are the offensive-focused unit, right? Where the Archi are about defense, Harbingers are about offense. And despite their appearance, they move at incredible speeds and can break the heart of the enemy line. And honestly, the book doesn't say much about them outside of that. It's just a real emphasis on their speed. You can kind of sum it up this way, where the Archi are the defenders and stewards of Nagash, the Harbingers are his fist, right? The one that reaches out into the enemy and crushes it. Now, the next unit today is the Cavalos Death Riders, and I gotta say, these are my favorite model-wise. Absolutely. Right? These are the shock cavalry and the bloodhounds of Nagash. Incredible warriors with devastating mounts on the charge. And the cool bit of lore about them is that rarely other societies will actually see the Death Riders until they are in super trouble. right? They don't show the Death Riders when they're coming up to say, hey, we're the Ossiarch Bonereapers, here's the deal, you're going to give us your bones or we're going to destroy you, right? They're not even in the picture at that point. They're not who you're dealing with. You don't see them, you don't know they exist. You find out that they exist if you break the contract or you reject the tithe. And then you're going to start to see what looks like, oh, look, our friends are coming on horseback. They can help us out repel these stupid undead. And then you slowly realize that they're not moving that fast. They're kind of just trotting along. But as they get closer, you see that they are just huge, horrific, and they are the fist of Nagash. Like I said, they are his shock cavalry, but also his bloodhounds, because they will chase their prey down to the ends of the earth. They don't need to sleep, right? They just keep going day and night. And so you can scramble and try to run away, but they will catch you. Only breaking into a full gallop on the charge, which is meant to both smash the main battle line of the enemy and also shatter their resolve by casting this aura of dread to anyone nearby, because they're so stinking scary. Now, a lot of their entry is actually focused more on the mounts than it is on the actual rider. I mean, the rider is basically everything we've talked about here before, which is a composite of different skeletons and the best, cavalry champions ever put into one, right? It's hard to not make it sound boring, but honestly, they're kind of is a template in that they fit into. But the mounts are something that's a little bit unique, because when I was wondering when I saw this army for the first time, right, I was wondering why they even used undead horses at all, right? If you can just make a new type of warrior, why not have like a centaur or something, right? The hands of a man and then the body of a horse, that kind of thing. Well, the horses are made of composite bones and souls too. These souls are a combination of historic steeds, unrelenting war horses, and even the wild beasts of the realm. So try to imagine ripping the soul out of something like a maw crusher and jamming it into something the size of a horse. It's going to have that same ferocity with it. However, it's not just that. And this is the point where I think to myself it makes more sense to have it be a separate, like a lesser creature. And the reason I say that is because any champion who rebels against Nagash or fails him enough can be put inside one of these horses. So you are like a subjugated creature, and you have just enough wherewithal mentally to know exactly what's happening, right? You have enough of a brain to grasp your own shame and punishment. And yet you are bound to do this service, and so you are a horse now, and that's the life that you get to have for eternity because you screwed up. A servant, a beast of burden, a creature who's always moving, never gets rest, and never gets rewarded. So they're not only part of this deadly unit, right? Which, because the Cavalos Death Riders, they are an incredibly powerful unit, but this unit also serves as a very practical reminder of the cost of failure. Always reminding, with the little monicum of freedom that they have, right, reminding all in the Ossiarch Bonereapers, you are just playthings to Nagash. He can make you beasts of burden and mindless creatures, and you will know with horror that you are nothing anymore. And now we're going to move into what the book calls the War Giants of Ossia. And this is the last 4 entries in this entire battle tome. And it showcases what the deviant minds of the Mortisans came up with, right? Remember I said before when we were talking about the leaders that the Mortisans were taken from predominantly, not all exclusively, but a lot of them were taken from this afterlife of artisans and craftsmen and engineers making marvels and incredible artwork, right? Well, what happens when you take that mind and you put it to the resources and the military structure of the Ossiarch Bonereapers? Pretty soon, they were not just concerned with making the human form, right? The Mortek Guard are incredible warriors, but they're fundamentally, even though they're composite of many people, well, many people's worth of bones at least, they look relatively humanoid, right? We can all agree on that. Same thing for the knights and the riders. They can be made of different souls, but fundamentally, they look something that we recognize. It's only when the Mortisans really got to grasp their new situation and the materials that they were working with that they kind of broke away from that constraint of the human form. Their creativity led them to create incredible deathless horrors, custom crafted to fulfill an express purpose within the army. And we're going to start the discussion of these with the Necropolis stalkers. This is the larger, the super tall warrior with 4 heads. All right, he's big. He's just an embodiment of the word blender. He stands far taller than the average human, and they lunge with this unnatural vigor across the battlefield. Where the rest of the army is very slow and plodding, these are the shock troops once the battle closes in. Right, remember the Mortek guard are forming a shield wall around all the leaders, but that entire unit, right, the leaders in the Mortek guard are moving forward very slowly and aggressively. They can't be broken, but they're slower. What happens is the Necropolis stalkers, when they get close enough, just launch themselves fanatic style into the fray, and they're able to chop up little weak points within the enemy line, and then the longer line of Mortek guard just come and sweep over them, basically. They are armed with a wide variety of weapons, and they have 4 arms to wield a whole combination of them. And uniquely, they have a mask, which is called, I'm going to just try and pronounce this, the Ossiarch mask. And simply put, each side is an amalgamation of great warriors, right? Where every other Ossiarch Bonereaper has one soul composite put inside of them, the Artisans designed these to be, okay, what's the best soul we could possibly make for being on the offense? Okay, what's the best soul that we can make possibly for being the most precise when it comes to, enemies that only have a single weakness or something like that? And they just took 4 of these and jammed them inside one giant body. So they're each, it's like 4 souls in one. They're each focused on a specific fighting style. And in this way, the stalkers can be both aggressive, right, charging headlong into the fight, being little blenders, but also simultaneously being very reactionary, changing tactics fluently as the battle goes on. And those 4 broad categories that I'm talking about is called the blade strike aspect, the blade parry, which is more defensive, precision, and then destroyer. And they rotate, each one of them has a different effect in game. It's kind of cool. And they rotate through those on the fly on the battlefield. So if they're chopping up little chaff units, right, the endless hordes of people who are rebelling against them, they can switch from one aspect to that, and all of a sudden they hit something bigger, like say a stormcast eternal, and immediately respond and change tactics as is appropriate. Now, when they're not on the battlefield or on the front lines, these actually act as the foremost guards of the giant Necropolis fortresses. So they're a sight that you could see relatively a lot. You would see the army coming with them, and then if you went to one of their fortresses to pay the tithe, you would also see them there. Now, alongside of those are the immortis guard. These built from the same kit, I believe, and then the second bodyguard option next to the morghast archi. And they are dead set on defending the leadership of the Ossiarch Bonereapers. And I'll be honest with you, there's not a lot of lore here. That's very straightforward of just we took the best people who are good at defending, and that's pretty much it. But I absolutely love this unit. In fact, it is my favorite aesthetically of unit in the entire faction. They're made from these souls that are focused on servitude and sacrifice, rather than necessarily being a warrior, but to fulfill their purposes, they do use shields and spears as weapon. And their role really is to instinctively intercept any blows that are intended for their masters, and fight off any enemy with a 1-2 punch of, you thrust the spear into the enemy, and then they also are masters of the shield bash, using that as a weapon as well, instead of just defensive. And now this is where designs get a little bit more hellish, because we're going to be talking about the Mortek crawler. This interesting war machine, I guess you can call that, was designed by Katakros personally. He actually has the original blueprint. It hangs in a place of honor within his own fortress to this day. And it is a revolting sight. It's a living war machine, right? A catapult monster that uses several little legs moving like a centipede to crawl across the battlefield. The idea of seeing this thing in motion is both horrifying and kind of sounds awesome. There's not really a mention of what souls go into it, which is kind of unusual. They've kind of pointed that out in every other entry, but I assume things like beasts of burden and stuff like that, things that are very mindless and don't have a problem, carrying huge burdens and being ordered to go different directions, stuff like that. Atop of each of the Mortek crawlers is a small crew to guide its fire. These are not made from warrior souls, but things like navigators and engineers and laborers, from people who have the optimal skills to load the firing arm and kind of gauge the ranges of the enemy, and also, most importantly, to decide what kind of ammunition is the most effective against them. It can launch just about anything from a block of cursed steel, a container of screaming souls, or a cluster of skulls made of death magic at the enemy. It has a lot of versatility, and you just kind of see it plodding along like a little battering ram, scraping across the surface of the ground, almost like it was a giant termite coming towards you. Very cool looking model. And the last unit here is the Gothazar Harvester, undoubtedly one of the sickest models in the Ossiarch Bonereaper line, and they really exemplify the theme of the faction, and I can't emphasize this enough. The theme being to create and destroy at the same time. It destroys enemies very efficiently, but it does so for the express purpose of creating new Ossiarch Bonereaper units. And they function as massive bipedal constructs. They're hyper aggressive. They're used as line breakers, much like the ones we talked about earlier, crashing into the enemy at full speed. They have these huge upper body arms, and they're either tipped with clubs made out of like raw realm of metal realmstone, or their scything talons just keep going through enemy, and they're all like, they stay constantly sharp with Shiatian magic. Regardless of what they're armed with, though, they carve into the enemy with this kind of feral joy, and that makes them super destructive. But their dual purpose is to harvest, right? Obviously, it's in the name. It harvests the key resource of the army, and that is, of course, bones. As they are hacking and slashing through the enemy, you'll see on the model there's tiny little secondary arms all over it, and it's gross looking. And they cover the sides and the back, and they're constantly picking up the remains of the dead that the main arms have just shredded in half or something. These little arms are picking up body parts, really, ripping the flesh off and loading the bones into this giant rib cage container on its back. So if you can imagine this from an aerial view, I was thinking about this, like what would this thing actually look like in combat, right? It makes a straight line into the enemy, and behind it, it leaves a trail of blood, gore, and sinew, right? Because the bones are actively being harvested. So you're not even seeing like dead bodies. You're seeing like a body that's been, turned into like jelly material because the bones got ripped out and they tore him inside out just to leave his, gore on the ground right there for you. It's so sick. The more I thought about it, I was like, this is super savage. And generally they return post-battle to the mortisans with the bones, right? They're just big carriers, basically. But if the need arises, they can actually use the bones straight from their back, meaning, typically they kind of go out and do their own thing. After the battle, they come back and then kind of deposit their whatever they've harvested. But if the need arises mid-battle, the harvester can kind of fall back a little bit, and the mortisans will make new constructs on the fly during the battle, using the things that they've gathered. And they can do this mid-battle to repair damaged fighters, which is pretty much what they kind of, that's what the mechanics kind of represent, as mid-battle repair. But fundamentally, they're going to be out front tearing things apart. It's insane and it's gross, and I love it, right? It's just a lawnmower that collects bones and leaves people paste in a red trail. Now, why are these units cool? As we kind of wrap up, I still have one more video I want to do on the Bonereapers about their individual legions, but why are these units cool? Well, there's not a lot behind many of them. Meaning, like, they don't have the same amount of lore. The mounts and artillery being living things, I thought was a really nice touch, right? They're not just, beasts of burden jammed inside things. Like, no. Like, the crawler is unique because it was designed by the Mortarch himself, as opposed to the other Mortarchs. I don't know of anything that they've personally designed, like themselves, in a big way. Maybe Arcan did something like that, but for the most part, like, Lady Ollander, we don't know if she designed anything at all. She's just leading an army that she was given. So the fact that Katakros has such a hands-on development mentality when it comes to this faction is really, really neat, as well as things like the mounts being a constant reminder, also the morghast archi, of like, this is the price of failure. You're constantly being watched and graded for what you say and how you achieve things, and there's this ever-present threat that you will fail and you will be punished for failure. The real winner for me, though, is the bigger constructs that push the bounds of design, right? Like, if you really could, have a substance like clay and make, the perfect army, why would it just look like humans? I wanted to see more of these big, ugly things that are just crazy out there, designs that work on the battlefields of the mortal realms, but maybe wouldn't make much sense to us here on Earth. I love it. I think really honestly the Gothizzar Harvester typifies that, but the Crawler does a great job, as do the dual kits of the Immortis Guard and the Stalkers. Now, if I had to make a Ossiarch Bonereaper army myself, I would probably do a lot of cavalry, because I like the models and I like the number of models that you could build an army with, that kind of stuff. But let me ask you this, what is your favorite unit? Tell me down below. And if you think one of them stands out as being incredibly cool lore-wise, I'd love to hear about it. In today's video, I wanted to dive back into the Ossiarch Bonereapers and explore the individual legions that make this army so terrifying. Even though I began the Bonereapers series talking about the exactness and the calculating nature of the faction, the truth remains that they have found ways to be unique even within that. That there's still room in all their efficiency to be adaptable to their mission and their environment, to evolve themselves based on those things and their available resources. And you can hold that in one hand, in the other hand, they still have that precision that makes them so deadly. Now, there are 6 such legions mentioned in the Battle Tome, and today we're going to explore them all. As always with these kinds of videos, I want to make something very clear, is that every legion has access to every unit, right? Assuming it's not a character or something like that. So if one focuses on, say, cavalry, you can and should still buy infantry for it if you're building it that way. Don't let these things constrict you. It's just adding a little bit of flavor and narrative to the different legions. I often get messages that are like, I like this color scheme, but I can't because they're a cavalry-based army and I want to own infantry. It's like, no, build whatever you want. These are narrative nudges, not walls. And so with that out of the way, let's talk about the mortis praetorians. And we'll start here because, as these books often do, we start with the poster boys, right? The mortis praetorians are everything we explored about the Ossiarch Bonereapers, only more so. Cold, calculating, exacting, and utterly dangerous. This is the legion of Katakros himself, and in fact, all the named heroes outside of Nagash and Archon who don't have a specific legion that they work with are from the mortis praetorians. When Katakros was selected for this role and presented his personal legion, right, who he would be working with, he went back to his little slice of the afterlife and pulled all the great generals who served him both in life and in death. He took those souls and then had his soul masons meticulously split them apart into as many pieces as possible. Now you might say why? Well, he imbued each cohort, right, each organization of troops with the experience, temperament, and determination of a great leader from the past. So an example here, just to kind of clarify, is that there's a cohort within his legion called the Jaquian cohort. Each member has a sliver of the screaming soul of a general named Jaghack the Wise in them. He lives in eternal torment, torn to shreds amongst so many warriors. And this, what this really does is it keeps all the fighters from a specific cohort on the same page, because they all have this link intrinsically to each other, and they all also share the same skill set from some great general in the past. One other thing that I really like about this legion, this army, the way it's composed, is they're supposed to be the poster boys in the lore in the realms themselves. We look at them okay, well, that's the company, color scheme that GW went for. But the idea is, when someone looks upon their works, right, they should see the paradise that Nagash has envisioned. And so their contracts are honored to the T. They build these incredibly ornate fortifications, demonstrating the artistry and order of Nagash's vision for the realms. They keep very exact numbers of troops at their disposal, with the morticians creating new soldiers as they fall in real time. And this is what I mean by saying Ossiarch Bonereapers, only more so, right? They're intended to be the spitting image of this faction, both for us as readers, but also for the people in the realms, because all the other ones we're going to talk about are a wild departure. And that's a lot of pressure to put on one, but of course that makes sense that if you want to have your standout faction be the perfect example of everything you're about, of course the Mortarch and all the named characters are going to be a part of that one. Where the mortis praetorians are the picture-perfect design of an Ossiarch Bonereaper legion, the petrifex elite stand as an anomaly. And we're going to see this kind of a theme going on throughout the rest of these. There's this rumor that in the Age of Myth, as the legions were first being developed, that Nagash gave the petrifex elite Mortesians, or that whole cult, a mission, summed up in one sentence, but nobody knows what that mission was. There's a few theories like, oh, your job is to go out and instill fear in the realms, or crush people's hopes, or to take on the finest bodily remains so no other necromancers out in the realms could use them. Whatever, impression was made by Nagash upon this legion changed them drastically. They still retain the cold, calculating nature of the Ossiarch Bonereapers, but they don't build societies or structures. The petrifex elite are singularly focused on the devastation of their enemies. Things like artistry and fortifications and individuality are useless to them. The second bit about them that is arguably the most unique is their material. See, other legions will harvest any bones around them or available to them, like people, animals, that kind of thing. But the petrifex elite only make their soldiers with petrified remains from long dead creatures or people. Like fossils, think about it that way, where the bone is slowly replaced with a rock composite. This generally makes them fewer in number, but they have unholy levels of durability and resilience. Each is a walking tank able to absorb incredible amounts of damage and deliver it in turn with these eternally sharp blades. And it's this dark appearance of petrified bone that makes their look so unique. It's aesthetically my favorite of the legions. And the fact that they'll leave material on the ground, just normal everyday bones from you and I, they'll leave them on the ground for less discerning, quote unquote, legions to find, I think is quite funny. They have this little I'm superiority complex based within them amongst other legions. Now, next up are the Staliarch lords. Believing themselves to be noble warriors of honor and good repute, the Staliarch lords are a terrifying sight to behold. This is a legion that leans very heavily on its cavalry to the lion's share of the killing. They often run down their prey, encircle them, give them chase, and then the problem is, for as honorable and regal as they think they are both terrifying to see and really sketchy in their dealings. When it comes to their looks, the Staliarch lords run down their prey, but they don't do a whole lot of cleaning and caretaking afterwards, So this white bone that their mounts and even the warriors are made from is stained red and pink with the gore from their victims. They shred bone from flesh with their bare hands after combat in the field, and hunks of meat and gore are clogged into the joints of their mounts and their limbs. It's really described as this mobile horror show. And in this way, when they show up to collect their tithe, they're wearing the remains, the blood and viscera of the last person who failed to deliver, which I imagine makes it a very imposing scene. And that image right there is a good segue into their sketchy dealings, which is something else I want to talk about, which is, first off, they will honor any deal or agreement that they make. So they're not without honor in any sense of the word. They just happen to make insane demands and requests. So instead of doing the math, for example, most of their legions would say, okay, well, this faction has X number of people. They will probably have this many dead in a year, and we can calculate, a reasonable sum of material to gather from this little, village or something like that. Very reasonable stuff. They'll make outrageous demands, you need to have 1 ton, 2,000 pounds of bones per person here, which is that's just, maybe you can do it the first time, but not anything after that. Or they'll pose a 1-to-1 challenge between the leaders of both civilizations, which of course, you have a mounted mega hero for the Staliarch lords versus just some average Joe. It's a insurmountable fight. They're never going to win. However, in the eyes of the Staliarch lords, they've provided a means for the tithe to be met honorably. So when the person receiving this offer can't make it, they forfeit any rights to survival and are slaughtered brutally. If somehow the person receiving this offer can meet the demands, they'll live. Like I said, it's not like they're backstabbing and stuff like that. They'll honor the bargain that they make. They just make really outlandish deals. Almost to the point where it seems like the Staliarch lords simply just don't want them to be able to achieve it. But by far one of the most interesting legions is the Ivory Host. And this is one that honestly, like just visually, they don't really appeal to me. But when I started digging into their lore, I fell in love with them. So, led by the Monarch of Tusks, known in her former life as Gyuri Za, the Drake Slayer Queen, they have one mission which is equally awesome and ambitious, and that is to conquer Gur, the realm of beasts. And I'll come back to that here in just a second. That's important. The location is anyway. Appearance-wise, the Ivory Host would fool you into thinking that their focus was on artistry or aesthetic perfection. Their bones are perfectly cleaned, meticulously kept in pristine condition, eternally sharp and well taken care of. They're also a naval-focused faction, which is something that really wasn't gone into anywhere else in the lore. They sail in these fleets of bone construct ships. So when they come into an area, it has this like macabre beauty to it, right? It looks super goth, but you can see like the amount of artistry and care that's taken into it, and it's just kind of breathtaking. And this like veneer of everything looking perfect and clean, it all falls apart when they start fighting. Because here's the thing about the realms. They change you. And it's something I try to touch on whenever we talk about where factions are from or where they're fighting or going and that kind of thing. Whatever realm you are in, it does subtly change you over time. Gyuri Z was given a monumental task, taking a perfectly ordered army, remember Ossiarch Bonereapers, into the rampaging world of wild beasts, right? They hunt colossal wild monsters on a daily basis. They're being infused with energies from Gur all the time. They construct their armies from the remains of these creatures, and of course, over time, it changes them. When an Ivory Host warrior falls, those around them just go into an absolute wild frenzy. They go nuts, right? They break ranks. They just start hacking and slamming. All the things we love about Gur pour out of them. The thing is, Gur is like the polar opposite of what an Ossiarch Bonereaper should be doing. It's not Bone Reaper-like, and it has everything to do with their environment, and they've actually been called out on this before. Because remember, all these heroes, when they bump into each other, like they do have to answer to one another, and everyone ultimately answers to Nagash. But the leader of the Ivory Hosts will start to recite the countless victories, their feral carnage that they've been able to achieve, and saying like, well, if we didn't fight like monsters, none of these would have happened, and so it kind of justifies them, and things kind of blow over a little bit. The truth of the matter is, though, it's made very clear in the lore entry here that they understand that the spirit of Gur has conquered them just as they seek to conquer the realm. And there's a quote that I think sums it up perfectly, right? This is actually a quote from Gyuri Za, the leader, and it says, "To slay a monster, one must become just as monstrous. It is law." And I love that quote because it's first of all, the first part of it is a very Gur thing to sound like, right? To fight the monsters, we must become monsters ourselves. So, that kind of thing. I absolutely love it. But then what makes it like that little bit of Ossiarch Bonereaper thing is at the end tacked on is, it is law. As if like, okay, we need to like make this craziness fit squarely into our worldview. And so, I don't know, the law part, it sounds very undead, like, but tacked on everything else, you're like, but that doesn't make sense. It sounds so structured for something so savage that you're describing. I like the combination of the two. Now, another really interesting take on the Ossiarch Bonereapers, and this one has a lot less information, just raw information than others, and that is the null myriad. They really began as a prototype of the Bonereapers, right? In fact, it's said that they were the first of the legions. And the basic idea behind Nagash's, playing around with the construction of these specifically was, how much death magic can we stuff into them as possible and see what happens, right? What's the limit? Well, what this yielded was a legion of soldiers that were incredibly resistant to the warping and changing effects of magic and chaos. They became inflexible in their design, so saturated with one magic, particularly death, which is, a very stagnant kind of energy, that everything else would kind of just bounce off of them. And this gave them a very unique set of skills that add to the Ossiarch Bonereapers. Nagash and Katakros often send these warriors out to the far edges of the realms where they can exist in the most concentrated magical areas but not be affected. Remember, the further out in most realms that you get towards the edge, magic becomes raw and rampant and it kind of just mutates and warps things. This legion can just walk through it like it's no problem at all. It's kind of like they're wearing a hazard suit for magic, right? Which has only become more useful with the Necroquake, which destabilized magic everywhere. Because now you have endless spells roaming in the lands, and they dissipate upon the null myriad shields. Lightning attacks from wizards will fizzle out, flames will disperse upon them. They are this magical null zone that Nagash uses to crush his enemies. And a cool tidbit that's just kind of tacked in there randomly, I don't know, I wish there was like a short story about it somewhere, is that Arcan the Black struck a deal with Katakros when this legion was kind of in the midst of being created at some point. And so Archon offered a bunch of his skeleton warriors, who, of course, being near Archon and being near Nagash's are super densely infused with death magic themselves, just by natural cause. But he offered, hey, you can use them and their bones for material to build more of the null myriad, right? Even more of that hardened death magic. In exchange, the Mortarch of the Sacrament, meaning Arcan, can call in these warriors as he needs. And it's kind of this uneasy tension between the two Mortarchs, because the Mortarchs none of them really get along. None of them are friends. And they don't certainly want to be bound to each other, but it was a really good, kind of communal deal. And having a legion that is, so resistant to magic in so many ways can be really useful for someone who is themselves devastatingly good at using magic. It means, I can attack my enemy with magic, but they can't get me back. And I would just love to read like a short story of that conversation when they strike that deal. I think that it would just add a lot of character to both of the Mortarchs, and we could maybe see the value of the null myriad there. Now, last up is probably the biggest departure from Ossiarch Bonereaper, like generic lore, right? When we talked about all the things about the Ossiarch Bonereapers, this is the one that's like, okay, those guys are just different, right? And this is the crematorians. Where other legions are designed to grow and spread and build cities, largely, most of them are, the only purpose of the crematoriums is destruction, right? Everything else is secondary or non-existent. Defenders of a city will look out at the night and see an endless sea of torches of their enemy drawing near. And they're like, oh my gosh, we gotta get the defenses ready, we're gonna be fine, we gotta hunker down. And it's only too late that they realize those are not torches at all. But it's like literally the hateful fire of Nagash burning inside of every crematorium unit. And that's pretty much how it's described too, right? These flames represent Nagash's ire, and it consumes the troops in a terrifying way, making them the most expendable Ossiarch Bonereapers to exist. This fire inside of them is constantly consuming them. Their lifespan is measured in weeks, not years, which is, kind of the opposite of what you want for like an undead eternal army, right? They burn themselves out. And the Morticians are constantly at work replenishing the ranks. And the basic way that they fight is this. The first wave invades the city, fights like mad, they blow up as they die, and use themselves to burn down all the buildings. The second wave then comes in, collects the phylactery gems, which we talked about, basically soul stones, right? It has the mind and the soul of the warrior still inside of them, and the masons then build new bodies, and the whole process starts all over again. And while this makes for a powerful tool of destruction and fear for Nagash, right, this is his hammer that he can throw at people to terrify them, it's a frustrating life for all the leaders of the Legion. Because they can't really grow, the turnover is a constant issue, and even like all the leaders who, some of these from the original like founding legions are, they are truly immortal, they've been around for hundreds and hundreds of years, but even these leaders are burning out, and they have to like make promises to one another like, hey, will you bring me back? Will you get me a new body so I can come back? And so much so is this kind of frustration that their field commander, Zaranos, tries to scour libraries and arcane repositories for a quote-unquote cure, like how do we put the fire out so we'd stop burning before we can like grow and do good before everything is burned down by the first wave. So I like this one, as much as it is a wild departure, I like it because it has this little bit of subversion to authority there that I like, where it's like, they haven't found anything yet, but the fact that they keep looking for a way to undo the way that they were designed by Nagash, it's almost like they're searching for something that's close to hope, even though this is a faction that would not have hopeful people. So, I mean, it's one of those factions that, like, whenever there are those factions that have these big, hard right turn departures from the established lore of, like, the army itself, people either love it or hate it. There's not really much in between. Personally, I like it. If there wasn't that little tag on of, like, and the heroes are all trying to find a way to stop this, I would think they're kind of bland, right? It's like, oh, they just kind of burn themselves out. That's weird. But the fact that they have enough autonomy to be like, we were made broken and wrong, and we need to fix this. But ultimately, they're still servants of Nagash, right? The reason they want to fix it is so that they can keep killing people in the glory of Nagash. And so it's this fun little, like, it adds just a little bit of personality to them that I really enjoy. Now, really quickly, because there's so many of them, I'm not going to go into super detail, but why are these legions cool? Some of them are wild imaginings of Ossiarch Bonereapers, and that's a good thing, because when you have an army that's described as so rigid and can definitely be considered stale. When I say stale, I mean like stagnant is probably a better word than stale. But what I mean is, like, everything is talked about being very regimented and calculated and that kind of stuff. The fact that you get to see that in different lenses across the realms, given their environment and what they're building themselves with, that kind of stuff, I think is really interesting, right? You can maintain exactness while also being built for a specific job like the crematorians, or being affected by things around you like the ivory host. And I like that they took the time to make all of these very, very different. And so, if nothing else, if you don't like any of them, that's fine. But consider it an invitation to make something wild yourself. And I think that that's a really cool thing. If nothing else, it's permission to be like, you can be exacting and crazy, perfect, but also these places that they go to are wild, and so you can kind of craft whatever backstory you want. I think that was a smart move. I already showed my cards and I said what my favorite was. It's the Ivory Host. I love anything Gur, and the fact that they're kind of incorporating slowly the madness of the hunt that is Gur with their very structured and regimented, law-abiding nature is just a really cool twist that I thought was very interesting. But I'd love to know which of the legions was your favorite, and tell me why. What are you painting up? If you're painting your own. Welcome, wargamers, to the thick forests of actually, as we answer a listener question regarding the Stormcast Eternals and the Ossiarch Bonereapers. Who came first? Who's better? What's the similarities? And what's the differences? This topic comes from a question left in one of my videos by David Chan, and he asks, do Ossiarch Bonereapers count as Nagash's bootleg Stormcast Eternals? First of all, love the idea of a bootleg Stormcast. Just curious, since their creation is almost identical, except with multiple fragments of souls being put together. Awesome question, David. I talked about the contrast of them in my Ossiarch Bonereapers lore series, but I do think a fully dedicated video for both factions comparing and contrasting them is definitely worth some time. So we're going to talk about the origins of each, when they actually began to exist as a plan and then as an army, and then talk about their similarities and differences. If you have a question about Age of Sigmar lore that you would like answered, please leave them in the comments down below, as I use comments for content ideas for future videos. If I haven't gotten to it yet, just ask again on the most recent video. YouTube's a little bit weird about how it shows comments over time, like going backwards in time to look at comments for a video is a bit tricky. So, to talk about the timeline when it comes to the Ossiarch Bonereapers and the Stormcast, we're going to hop into our non-IP infringing DeLorean that travels through time and go back to the Age of Myth. Nagash is still part of the Pantheon. Things seem to be going very well on the surface, although the very first inklings of the Pantheon kind of falling apart are starting to show. The elves are becoming more reclusive, we now know, because they have Slaanesh trapped inside of Olg-Hish and they're taking elven souls from him, her. We know that Gorka Morka is becoming very restless under the control of Sigmar. Control's a strong word, but the direction. Grimnir has likely already been shattered into 1,000 bits of Urgold. And Nagash himself is thinking, I think that I should be the ruler of the realms. The world's a mess, and I just need to rule it. Bonus points if you get that reference in the comments below. And so Nagash takes this opportunity to devise a few plans. First up is the Black Pyramids. He essentially begins raising skeletons that have no other purpose except to walk from the dead center of Shyish, Nagash's out to the very far edges of it, bring home one pebble of grave sand. It's like the realm stone of Shyish. And they can only bring it one pebble at a time, like literally one pebble like beach sand at a time, because it's so potent that even then some of these skeletons blow up in death magic and they can't be put back together. So he starts this like millennia-long trail of ants that are just going from Nagashazar out to the realm's edge and back again, one grain of sand at a time, building the Black Pyramids. This is going to eventually be the cause of the Necroquake. When he puts the finishing touches on it, he essentially breaks magic and inverts the realm of Shyish so that all of the death magic is in the dead center rather than the realm's edge like every other realm. And this is his master plan. With this, he intends to basically kill all life within the realms, immediately raise them as undead that he has control over, and then fight chaos back. And it's not a bad plan at all, because without mortals, meaning he kills everything, there's nothing for the chaos gods to feed off of. They will stagnate, and Nagash will be able to seize control. But there's a second plan that he has, because it's not enough to just win through like starving your enemy out, meaning starving the chaos gods of emotion. He needs to have armies to be able to go fight anything that's left. This is a setting, remember, Age of Sigmar is different than 40k, where demons can exist outside of any kind of warp rift permanently. So like even if he killed everyone who's mortal, there's still huge armies all over the place he has to go deal with. So he puts part 2 of his plan together. He's going to build an army, but not a normal army of, billions and billions of skeleton warriors that die to a stiff breeze. Instead, he wants something concrete. An army that can act as a finishing blow for the Chaos Gods. Not that they're specifically tailored to fight the Chaos Gods, but rather that would be the only opponent left. And so he begins devising a plan for what we know as the Ossiarch Bonereapers. First, he creates a whole bunch of soul masons and bone shapers, and their jobs are essentially to go around Shyish. The soul masons are collecting the souls of the best warriors, the best fighters that are remaining there, the ones that Sigmar didn't get for the Anvils of Heldenhammer. And the bone shaper is just going around and taking all of the bones, of which Shyish would have a plethora, and collecting them and using them as raw material. What really happens in the Age of Myth specifically is that Nagash creates this caste of mortisans, as they're called, but these are the artisans, the builders, the designers of what we would know as the Ossiarch Bonereapers. That initial caste of leadership, and he puts them underground and says, okay guys, you have all the time you need, build me an army, the best that you can do. And he essentially just leaves them to that task. He knows the pyramid's going to take millennia, he has this kind of slow roll army being built, and so he's not in a rush. Nagash is all about time, he's got all of it. And that's pretty much where the story ends at this point. Now, he knows he needs a leader for said army, and so he goes and eventually meets a guy named Katakros in the underworlds, and elects him through, there's a whole series of things, but basically elects this guy to be the leader of this new faction, the Ossiarch Bonereapers. They give him a new body, one that's like formed by the Mortisans. And while there are some very early skirmishes that use Ossiarch Bonereapers, the full might of them is never really fully seen in the Age of Chaos or Myth. Like the full power of them. They do present themselves in one epic battle. Katakros goes to fight Sigmar, because Sigmar is ticked. If we fast forward our time a little bit, Pantheon is broken. Sigmar's super pissed at Nagash, goes after him. Katakros tries to intervene, and basically Sigmar just backhands him into oblivion. Katakros is locked up inside a vault inside of Lethis City, and the Ossiarch Bonereaper project pretty much just stays underground, building as they were instructed to do. The Age of Chaos happens, it's unstoppable. Sigmar withdraws back to Azir and begins working with the dwarven god of crafting Grogni on designs for a new kind of soldier. So, to answer your question here, David Chan, technically the Stormcast are a knockoff of the Ossiarch Bonereapers. They came first, chronologically. Now, of course, their full army might wasn't displayed back then, but the project was started first. Stormcasts are made, all the various chambers, they're unleashed in the realms, and then during the Soul Wars, the second chapter of the Age of Sigmar, that is when Nagash is ready. He springs the trap of the Necroquake. It doesn't go quite as well as he thought it would, but hey, look at this. I got a whole army right here. A whole bunch of new guys, the Ossiarch Bonereapers. I kind of liken this to if you ever watch one of those cooking shows when they show you all the raw meat and they go and then just put it in the oven for 40 minutes and they pull out an already baked whatever. I feel like that's what Nagash did. Of just like, oh look, I happen to have this fully baked cooked army right here, and just unleashes it all at once. It's like, whoa man, that's a neat trick. And that's when we as readers were introduced to the Ossiarch Bonereapers, and there was a whole bunch of MacGuffins and backtracking on, oh, they were always here, all that kind of stuff, like they always do. It's whatever, but chronologically from our real world, they were released afterwards. So with our timeline set, let's take a look at these two types of soldiers, right? Let's take, say for example, a Liberator, which is the most basic fighting unit of a Stormcast, and a Mortek Guard, which is the basic fighting unit of the Ossiarch Bonereapers. Both of them, I'm just going to throw it out there, are deeply unnatural. Like Stormcast shouldn't be. Essentially, a Stormcast is made when Sigmar finds the soul of someone he deems worthy. He picks them up, gives them one good meal, and then puts them on the Anvil of Apotheosis, where essentially they are broken and reforged again and again and again. And in the process of doing this is not just to make them bigger and stronger and give them all kinds of power and literally rebuild their bodies to be more physically mighty, but also they're grafting part of Azir into the soul. This is a thing that comes up in the Soul Wars books, as well as some later stories with Morathi investigating what's going on with the Anvils of Heldenhammer in Har-Kuron. The gods are noticing that when they capture a Stormcast and they inspect them, they see the human soul. They see the person, the mortal that used to be, and then there's this thing just kind of grafted on, and no one really understands how the grafting part works. That is the secret of Grugni and Sigmar alone. How do you take the raw power of a realm and infuse it into a soul? And this is what, if you're curious, when a Stormcast dies and they arc like lightning back to Azir, it's that grafting portion that does that. They pull the soul back to Azir, where they can then be reforged with a new body. So for the Stormcast, they used to be one thing, a person. They got augmented by Sigmar on the Anvil of Apotheosis, and now they have a job to do, which is fight and die for eternity over and over and over again. They retain individualism. To an extent, the more reforgings you have, the more you lose that, but they do have a lot of personal intelligence. They're able to use their own skills. Faculties that served them well in life will transfer over to their immortal lives. They are people. They're just people that have been tweaked with. Now, the Ossiarch Bonereapers are different. They are the collection of multiple souls that have been shredded into pieces. And so let's say we have a great warrior who he's awesome on the battlefield, good at leading men, but he is realistically more of a lover. Very charming person, very nice. He believes in family and country and all those wonderful attributes, a lot of loyalty. Nagash is going to look at this soul and he's going to tear it to pieces and take the generalship and the martial pride and nothing else. And so when you do that a whole bunch of times, and you just take the best bits of what you want in a soldier, and then you mash them together, you get a hodgepodge of souls. This is the soul that's put into an Ossiarch Bonereaper. They have far less mental faculties, individuality, meaning if a situation happens that is surprising on the battlefield, the Stormcast might be able to intuit what to do, look for weaknesses, kind of assess it on the fly with their own intelligence, whereas the Ossiarch Bonereapers don't have that to an extent. The leadership might, but the average soldier does not. They have the skills to move forward and fight very effectively, but not that creative level where strategy is born. Unless their souls were specifically tweaked to do that, like in the case of leaders. That has to be a particular part that Nagash removes from somebody to make a thoughtful leader. And since that is ultimately irrelevant on your bottom barrel troop, the Mortek Guard, it's not there. It's the equivalent of something, surprising. Let's say a kraken bursts out from underground. The leaders can kind of put together a plan and then communicate it, but if the leaders aren't there, the Mortek Guard are just file not found. Don't know how to deal with this, I'm just going to walk forward and stab it. Which very much might not be the best plan. Now, in terms of that's their souls, but in terms of their bodies, the Stormcast basically are given a new body every time they reforge. And this is an interesting thing. It does weigh on them heavily that over battles they will accrue scars and, injuries, this kind of stuff, you have a bad arm or whatever. But then when they're reforged, those things go away. They have a new body, but it's the same body, but it's not. And that's an interesting kind of mental gymnastics that a few authors have touched on that I really do enjoy. where their own selves feel foreign, even though it's themselves. They just healed everything, but it doesn't feel right. But they do bleed, they do need to eat, all these things. Whereas the Ossiarch Bonereapers, rather than being forged of lightning, they basically are able to craft bone material, that kind of osseous material, into like putty. And then each soldier is handcrafted, which is why it took millennia for them. So a lot more personal attention to detail for that to make them the best fighting force there is, even though it yields less individualism. Now, an interesting counterpoint to these two factions, though, is what happens when they die. Like, stormcast, obviously, they fall apart, they arc back to Azir, they're put on the Anvil of Apotheosis again, they are reforged, given a new body. Ideally, barring any kind of corruption to the soul or anything like that, stormcast can just keep coming back and go straight into battle. There's multiple stories of that happening. In theory, once Sigmar achieved enough soldiers, he would never need to make more. And of course, that's not true. There are casualties permadeath for Stormcast under the right circumstances, and so he is still eyeing up souls around the realm and plucking them up and kind of adding it to this war machine. But that is different than the Ossiarch Bonereapers, who are continuously on the verge for more supplies. You see, Sigmar has a limit. There's a limit on how many souls they can reforge in a timely manner, how many souls are available for him to pluck up and turn into Stormcast, but there's no limit for the Ossiarch Bonereapers. Nagash has all the souls he'll ever want. We're constantly making more by having families, if you live in the mortal realms, of course. And all he needs is raw material, which exists in a great bounty across the realms. He needs souls, he needs bones. He's got the souls, and now the Ossiarch Bonereapers go around doing tithes for bone material. What we get when we look at these is that Sigmar has a great war plan for attrition. He made so many soldiers, he's losing some, but he's also gaining a few. But the fact that he can recycle the same warrior over and over and over again means he has a very consistent level of troops, whereas the Ossiarch Bonereapers are a snowball. They start small, but the more they fight, the more bones they collect, the more material they get, the more soldiers they can make, the more souls that they've rented from their enemies, and they're putting them together and stitching them up to make them look like, or make them fight worthy. And that's the idea. It's a slow, millennia-long death meant to envelop all of the mortal realms. Whereas the virtue of the Anvil of Apotheosis itself, unless they build a second one, does put a cap on the number of Stormcast that can be reforged in a given day. But that snowball of Ossiarch Bonereapers is always rolling. It's slow, but it'll get there. And in that way, even though they are very much on the surface very similar, and they are, we'll talk about that, they do pose a very different kind of threat to the mortal realms, one that is much more long-term. Like, maybe Sigmar didn't see chaos coming, but every character in the mortal realms can see, if they know about them, the Ossiarch Bonereaper threat and what it means to society. The thing is, though, it's not an immediate threat. So all these characters, all the gods can be like, I'm going to put that in, pin that in the back of my head. We'll circle back around later. But it's always there. Every fight makes the Ossiarch Bonereaper stronger. Unless you completely eviscerate the entire army, all you're doing is leaving raw materials for them as your troops die. Now, onto their similarities. Now, very brief here. Yes, they are very much so the quote-unquote my dudes of a particular god, right? The Stormcast are Sigmar's dudes. The Ossiarch Bonereapers are Nagash's dudes. Both were custom tailor-made to serve a purpose. One was to fight chaos, the other was to snowball and basically turn the entire realms into a necropolis. But honestly, I'm here for it. I like the idea of those factions each having their own quote-unquote guys, because we see this with the Chaos Gods too, right? We have the Blight Kings for Nurgle, we have the Arcanites for Tzeentch. Like, there's all different things. Every god has their people, and why should Nagash be any different? So David, I hope this answers your question and sheds a little bit more light. The story arc being Ossiarch Bonereapers were the OG, and then Sigmar reinvented the wheel and then had to deal with the OG wheel. And so now we're in an eternal battle between Stormcast and Ossiarch Bonereapers with a lot of things happening in between. In our last video, we explored a high-level view of the Ossiarch Bonereapers, this calculating faction of undead formed from raw bone material and composite souls of the best and the brightest in the realm of death. But there reached a point where I could no longer really dive into the lore of the faction, right, without talking about their leader, which is the subject of today's video. If you're not familiar, the title of Mortarch, or the actual rank, is bestowed by Nagash alone to those immortal servants of his that he leaves in charge of huge swaths of his empire. Lieutenants, basically. Largely independent leaders who carry out the will of Nagash on a grand scale. The last Mortarch we were introduced to was Lady Allander, Mortarch of Grief, and the sole leader of the Night Haunt. And while she is a fascinating character in her own right, I will say that she's not nearly as integral to the Night Haunt faction as our current subject of discussion is to his respective faction, where their stories are so intertwined that the leader and those he leads are two halves of a whole. Today we're talking about Orpheon Katakros, the Mortarch of the Necropolis, High Ruler of the Ossiarch Bonereapers, Nagash's personal Alexander the Great, who was given an army that is equally unholy and unyielding. And it's his life and personality that are what we're going to be talking about all today, as we explore what kind of person it takes to turn, right, the thing we talked about in the last episode, these militant accountants, right, we mentioned before, into an army on par with the demigods of Azir, the Stormcast Eternals. Now, the story of Orpheon Katakros begins in the Age of Myth, in Gur of all places, which is not something I expected at all. He was born in a free city, which I'm going to pronounce as Fleich. I assume this is a play on the German word for meat, which is pretty on the nose when it comes to Gur, because all the stories we've had from Gur are about them being able to deliver meat to the other parts of free cities and things like that. Regardless, that's how I'm pronouncing his Fleich. But Orpheon was a weird kid, super driven to exceed at anything he put his mind to. And ambition is not a bad thing, but the intensity of it was very off-putting. He viewed all recreation and fun as weakness, and enlisted in the army there, known as the Fleich Echelon, as soon as possible. And it was in the military that Orpheon found his true calling, because he was always seeking to be like the best at everything like that. The highest personal achievements, to be the best everything that he put his mind to as a child. But in the military, there's no roof to personal achievements or glory in battle. And the arts of tactics and strategy provided him with infinite schools of thought to devour and obsess over constantly. And he became that man obsessed, right? Rising through the ranks of the city's military incredibly fast, with the twin goals of proving himself dominant to everyone else and enforcing his will upon others. Now, when I say enforce his will, I don't mean that he's just like this angry tyrant. I think that emotions are kind of detached from him between raw ambition. But what I mean by enforce his will is the same kind of thing that Nagash does, right? I know what's best. My achievements are proof of that. Therefore, I should be in charge, and I am the sole person qualified to lead us, right? It's that arrogant kind of enforce my will, where I'm going to direct the current of the river kind of thing. And from a certain point of view, right, like Nagash's thing, right? From a certain point of view, you're not technically wrong, but from literally every other point of view, you're very wrong and you look supremely arrogant. Because his drive, his ambition, it didn't come from a place of compassion, right? It wasn't because he wanted the best for his people. It's just because I need to show that I'm the best and therefore follow me. It wasn't about helping other civilizations. It was about proving himself dominant and correct. And really, when we talk about Katakros, that's really the driving factor, right? Proving himself right was always the goal. That I have this worldview, it is superior to others, and I need to show that to everyone. And it wasn't some like idle hubris where people just sit around and, daydream about how great they are. He worked really hard, constantly refining his battle strategy and tactics, poring over maps and atlases of conquered kingdoms, refining, learning, obsessing, and then delivering on that knowledge. He conquered huge swaths of Gur before coming upon one of the Beasts of Chaos armies there, an all-herd group of the Garrick coast. So he's clearing out all these enemies, all these opponents, and he comes across a Beast of Chaos army, and Orpheon leads a fantastic assault. He makes use of catapults and shield walls. He breaks the spirit of their army, which of course it's Beast of Chaos. It's not hard to get in their own way. And as they were retreating, Orpheon intended to run them down. Because, like we all know, Beast of Chaos, quick to rally and assault again. He's like, no, we hit them where it hurts. Let's just mow them down and we'll be done with this. However, he ran into a huge problem in trying to do this. See, in leading this mighty charge to run down the enemy, Orpheon's men failed to keep up with him. He was on a chariot. I'm not sure if they were on horseback. It doesn't really go into that kind of detail, but for whatever reason, he became separated from his army. And soon, the great warlord found himself alone in the middle of a counterattack by the beast. They faded back as if they were retreating and then slammed Orpheon when he was by himself. He was knocked from his chariot and swept up by a Gorgon, which if you don't know is that colossal beast from the Beast of Chaos. And even though he pierced the beast's heart with his spear, the Gorgon fought on, ripping Orpheon Katakros limb from limb. So that ends the life of Orpheon Katakros. Round 1 lost. And here's the thing, all souls go to Shyish, the land of the dead. And it's a very unique realm in its makeup. And you can see my video, I'll leave it in the description down below, about Shyish, because I don't want to go into too much detail here. But super briefly, there is the greater plane that is Shyish, and then honeycombed beneath it is thousands of little mini pocket realms, if you will. And basically, these are all the actual afterlives of people in the realms. If a culture has a belief about the afterlife, it actually manifests there, meaning that every belief of the afterlife is technically true. However, once that society or thought, belief, that kind of stuff, once it fades away, like those people become extinct or they move away to a different religion, that afterlife will kind of fade into the greater plane of Shyish. So to that end, Katakros awoke as a spirit in the land of Ossia, a Shyish domain of order and purity, right? The grace of the Flitchians that valued hard work and diligence. And all the other undead around him, right? They're all kind of like these like shades and like wisps of death energy. Right? All the other ones knew contentment in their labors, right? This was a happy place. This was a place like a heaven you went to go and like toil in peace. To the north of Ossia was the land of Necros, a land where the Flitchian dead believed their hard work in life would result in praise and luxury in the afterlife, right? It was a place of wine, olives, relaxation, and bliss. So they're from the same, group of people. They're both Flitchians, but one was, their version of the afterlife was of meaningful labor, contentment, and the other one was about excess and relaxation and paradise. So here arrives the spirit of Katakros, seeing the disparity between the two afterlives of his own people. You have humble laborers on one side and decadent indulgences on the other, and he gets upset. Now this is a problem. Imagine if you, whatever your version of heaven is, right? And if you don't believe in one, make one up for a hot second. You get there and you go, this sucks, right? And I can't fathom how disappointing that is. But everyone around you is absolutely happy. Well, because Shyish is a very real place and is a very real realm, they do have standing armies. For that, each of these places, Ossia and Necros, in theory have armies to defend their borders and keep their kingdom safe. Remember, Shyish is an ecosystem. There are monsters that eat spirits. There's some other afterlives that are bent on conquest, like, imagine, for example, like a Viking-esque afterlife where it's always like pillaging and conquering and joy of battle and that kind of thing. That afterlife is just as much real as your peaceful, indulgence paradise. And in addition to that, there's necromancers that come down and want to come in and control some of these spirits, just kind of grip them and take control of them. So Katakros joins the army, the Ossian echelon. At this point, the story kind of yada yada yadas a bit, if you know what that means, just kind of fast forwards a little bit. And he rises through the ranks of the Ossian echelon very quickly, because he's applying all these skills that he learned in life to an undead army that is no longer concerned with things like time, or food, or pride. But the problem is, all these warriors who died and, are spending their time in the afterlife serving as well, nobody likes them. Right, this is supposed to be a defense army, and he's still locked in the mindset of conquest. And his inhumanity, right, for lack of a better word, in terms of being a compassionate person who's just seeking an eternity of bliss and contentment, is just very unsettling to everyone around him. And that's where Katakros spends quite a bit of time, is in this weird place of he's, darn near in charge of the entire military of Ossia, but nobody else really wants to follow him into battle. They kind of butt heads with him quite a bit, and he doesn't fit into his own culture's afterlife. Now we're going to pause the story there for a minute and talk about Nagash, because Nagash's story starts in Age of Sigmar, with Sigmar finding him and kind of incarcerated in some natural forming prison, and once freed, Nagash feigned gratitude and immediately began conquest of Shyish. At one point in time, and I hope they revisit this a bit more in detail, there were like lesser gods, like, I don't know, not demigods, but smaller deities of death, and he went ahead and just consumed them. He set up his home in the dead center of the realm, named his city Nagashazar, raised an army, and began conquest from there. Now, what nation should be right near Nagashazar but the twin nations of Ossia and Necros? Now, like I said, the armies of Ossia were about defense, right? It was perfect to have a soul like Katakros kind of there laying around, who by this time had worked his way to being the absolute head of the entire army. Because when Nagash's forces rolled in, he wasn't necessarily directly leading them, he was building the city, he was doing all kinds of things, so his autonomous army was kind of just strolling out, conquering things. Well, when it met the borders of Ossia, the army now led by Katakros was able to competently repel the near endless waves of undead by Nagash, which is no small feat. Now at this point, seeing his neighbors in Necros struggling to keep their border safe because they had no real military. Remember, it was a place of like peace, paradise, and decadence after all. Katakros made the proclamation to annex Necros, claiming it to be for everyone's good. And this is another example of him enforcing his will, right? I'll protect you because you can't protect yourself and I know what's going on, but now you're mine. And this must have gone on for some time, right? A force that would not falter against Nagash is a huge deal. So huge, in fact, that at some point over the many years of waves coming after Ossia and Necros, it drew the gods' attention, which of course sealed the doom of Ossia and Necros. Because one of the things you don't want in this fictional setting is the attention of Nagash. Nothing good ever happens when he actually takes time to look at you. And when that eye of a god turned to his cities, then the full breadth of Nagash's power was kind of revealed to Katakros, like seeing that, oh, there's no victory here, right? We can't kill a god. We can push away these minions forever, but we can't stop Nagash. With that realization, Katakros marched from Ossia to Nagashazar, and with all the full ceremony and pomp and circumstance, and knelt before Nagash with a proposal. Now, knowing what we do about Nagash, this is again truly significant, right? And the book really does highlight the significance of this. Is first that Nagash even listened to a bargain, that there was some mortal soul, that's now dead of course, but that there was some soul, some lesser entity that Nagash would even entertain in his court, and second, that he accepted it. Such was the reputation that Katakros had garnered by being able to push back the army of a god that he earned Nagash's interest. And what was that deal? Well, here's basically what it is. Ossia and Necros would serve Nagash eternally. In exchange, Katakros would be put in charge of Nagash's army. At this point, think about what's on Nagash's mind, right? He has either started or is thinking about the long game, right? Starting this incredible new army that's going to take over the realms far, far in the future. He doesn't have any leader for them selected. In walks a guy who led a bunch of humble workers and lazy rich people to defy him and his forces, like straight up, for quite unassuming is about a significant amount of time. And he did it without any special gimmick, like he didn't have a god beast or an artifact or anything like that. He just was so calculating and mean when it came to combat that he was able to repulse the armies of a god. Right? Just that charisma, charisma, capital C, not the actual you like them, but just the infectious power of his leadership and an iron fist, right? And this is just a no-brainer. Nagash has a job opening, and Katakros was right there getting in on the ground floor. To seal the deal, the specter that was Katakros was led to a ceremonial pit, and a new body was crafted for him, a perfect statue of Shyish, made living by the spirit of one of its greatest. This is the true Katakros, the one we know. He was dispatched to prove himself by conquering the many afterlives that honeycomb Shyish, and he did so with brutal efficiency. And that's probably why we don't hear much about him during the Age of Myth from other sources, because he never left Shyish. He went deeper and deeper into it, where fewer and fewer messages would get out to let us know about him. And at this point, the story fast forwards a bit, right? Centuries pass until the Battle of the Burning Skies. We don't know how long that stretch of Age of Myth was, but we can assume that he has garnered quite a bit of reputation. His armies are being built as we speak, that kind of thing. We're not quite sure, but we fast forward to right at the moment when chaos is coming into the realms. Nagash doesn't show up at the Battle of Burning Skies, and the Pantheon falls apart. Sigmar is furious and goes on a tear through Shyish to get revenge, seeing Nagash as the Judas, the backstabber, who made everything fall apart. In response to this, Nagash dispatches Katakros to repel the armies of Sigmar, even though he knew that Katakros could never defeat him. Katakros obeyed. When the god of Azir and Katakros met each other on the battlefield, it was fierce and intense, but here's the thing, nothing could stop Sigmar in his full fury. Apparently he still had Gal Maraz at this point, which is something that me and the people in the Discord were chatting about. It's a little bit confusing because we were led to believe that he had already lost Gal Maraz by this point, but the book says basically he smashed into Katakros with the hammer and tore through him like a wrecking ball. The problem was, even the full might of a god could not truly kill Katakros. Whatever Nagash had done with him in this new body, or infused magic into them, I'm not sure what happened, but the soul was built in such a way, or refitted in such a way, that he just could not be completely destroyed. Now, the problem is there's precious little time to plan what to do at that point, right? Chaos was pouring into the realms, the retreat to Azir was about to be sounded, so Sigmar did what he could to kind of keep the immensely dangerous tool that was Katakros from serving his lord Nagash. And so, while in Shyish, beneath the city of Lethis, a storm vault was constructed, meant to conceal the most terrifying artifacts, tomes, and weapons from everyone, even the gods themselves. And in the heart of that storm vault, a prison was constructed for Katakros, and there he languished for centuries. So it seems almost like this event was the thing that snapped Sigmar out of his rage to be like, oh no, I can't waste time going against Nagash, I have to retreat back and be smarter than this. But since he already beaten Katakros and doesn't want it to go back to Nagash, he seals him away. And this all took place right at the top of the Age of Chaos. And so he's stuck there for hundreds of years, up to 1,000. We don't have exact dates or anything like that, but in that time, the painfully slow construction of a new undead army continued without Katakros. Nagash never gave up on his long-term plan, and what started as a side project that would take millennia was all of a sudden coming into fruition. Now, during the opening of the Soul Wars, our current narrative arc that we're in right now, the Storm Vaults were all revealed after the Necroquake. Once they were revealed, Nagash sensed, once again, the spirit of Katakros, sensing something that was super familiar. I know this guy, and he's not that far away. And so he sent Lady Olander, Mortek of Grief, that we talked about before, to go free him. There was this super epic battle that I covered in the Siege of Lethis series from the expansion book Forbidden Power, and I'll link that below for you. But in short, Katakros was freed, but at great cost to both the stormcast defenders and the undead legions who went in to get him. But that cost was worth it because now Nagash had his perfect army just about ready and the perfect leader to lead them. After Katakros was freed, Nagash then did a dark parody of reforging, where he tightened up his form, gave him some incredibly powerful artifacts to use as weapons, and made sure to leave his memory and hatred for Sigmar intact. And the rest of that story brings us up to the current time, right? Katakros was again unleashed upon the realms with a brand new, fully reinforced army, the Ossiarch Bonereapers. His ambition, tactics, and mastery of warfare combined perfectly with their calculating onslaught, and together they are the will of death made manifest. Starting in what used to be Ossia and Necros, Katakros started his bloody campaign, killing Stormcast, Chaos Warbands, Ogre Maw tribes, annihilating all in his path, with perfect precision and an iron fist, also taking the opportunity to learn about these new enemies, because a lot has changed since he got locked away. In the Stormcast Eternals, Katakros sees a new challenge, and the face of Sigmar, both of which he wants to conquer and absolutely tear apart. Having retaken his home country, Katakros now sets his sights on spreading like a deathly plague upon the realms, a void from which there is no return, no escape, and no life. The flood of bones from his conquests and the tithes of the locals all served his purpose. This army of undeath is becoming this snowball rolling down a hill, killing, collecting bones, making more troops, killing more, again, from now till eternity. And that is all the information on Katakros, Mortarch of the Necropolis. Let's talk about why is he such a cool character. The other Mortarchs that we have I feel personally, don't have enough backstory to explain why they have their positions, right? You can go, I guess Neferata and Arcan are really great exceptions. Manfred, why he was chosen, I don't feel like has as much kind of narrative backing. But when you look at Katakros, you're just like, I see the dots that led him to be chosen by Nagash, right? It just makes sense. He's the right guy at the right time. He proved himself in life, in the afterlife, 1,000 times over. So I love the fact that they kind of like, they added weight to him in a way that made him important, and it seems reasonable that he would be in charge of leading the Ossiarch Bonereapers. And in addition to that, when he was elevated to the status of Mortarch, right, of the Necropolis is the full title, he was chosen with a purpose, and we as readers in the narrative get to see that purpose be fulfilled, right? Everything that happens from now they're unleashing upon the realms is the millennia-long plan that is Nagash trying to conquer all of the realms. And we get to see it happen in motion. And one of the most important things for me when it comes to adding new characters is kind of like weaving them into the existing story, right? I don't mind, like some people get really upset when it's like, oh, where was he the whole time? I don't care. You know, what I do care about is how did you plug him into the narrative that we do know now, right? And his story is interwoven with the Age of Myth, the awakening of Nagash, the Age of Chaos, which is when Sigmar comes tearing into Shyish for revenge, the opening acts of the Soul Wars, right? He was there. He was locked inside the vault. That was kind of the whole point. They did a great job at fitting him into events, important beats within the greater story. And what I like about it is it makes him feel important, right? Even though he literally wasn't always there, he kind of was. When they kind of retroactively put him in the stories, you see that like he has been this weird shadowy figure that we didn't know about, but now we want to, right? Because he's kind of fit in there. Now it's like, oh yeah, of course he was there as well. And I always think when they do a good job at fitting these major characters that they add to the game into the beats of the story is kind of like, it's just when magic happens, right? It's just when they're interesting, they're relevant, and they're important. And for all those reasons, that is why I like Katakros, the Mortarch of the Necropolis. I'd love to hear your thoughts down below, as well as your thoughts on the model. Of course, there wasn't enough art to just have pictures of Katakros, almost 30 minutes of this video, but did the best I could. Thank you all so much for watching.